We got a question this morning. What is the most important question anyone will ever answer? And it's actually a question that Jesus asked. Jesus asked the question, but what about you? What about you, Jesus asked, who do you say I am? So that's my question for all of us this morning. What about you? What about you? What about you? Who do you say I am? Who do you say that Jesus is? We read already, we're in Matthew 16, but what about you, Jesus asked, who do you say that I am? And Simon Peter answered, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Jesus asked the question, what about you? And Peter gets it. And as a matter of fact, this is the first time a human being acknowledges Jesus. You are, Peter is saying, the anointed one, the Messiah. The anointed one actually means king, but it doesn't just mean king, it means the king to end all kings. In Revelation, we'll learn that it's the King of Kings, but it is the king, the last king, that's going to rule everything. The king that's actually going to make everything right and bring it back to how it was supposed to be. And Jesus has been showing us that for the last 2.5 years in his gospel life. It's actually part 36 in ours. I am the king, and Jesus agrees. But he's going to tell us something, but not like you're thinking. We know that Jesus is the king to end all kings. We know that Jesus is the Messiah because the whole time we've been reading the Gospels, Matthew's been telling us. But remember, they're walking with Jesus, and Matthew's writing this years later to say this is what happened. Matthew tells us in the very first verse, this is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And in chapter 1, it still says, the angel told Joseph, the virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and you call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. And Jesus, at the baptism, his baptism, and imagine standing there and seeing Jesus get baptized, and you don't know who he is. This is the beginning. And then heaven opens up and says, this is my son, whom I love. With him I'm well pleased. And all through the Gospel of Matthew so far, and all the other Gospels, the demons say it all the time. What do you want with us, Son of God? The demons shouted. Have you come here to torture us before the appointed time? They know who he is. But Jesus says, what about you? And this is the first time a human being gets it. And he says, who do you say that I am? And Simon Peter answered, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. 2.5 years, and the disciples finally get it. Peter gets it, and Peter becomes the spokesperson at this point for the disciples for everything. As a matter of fact, every listing of the disciples' names, Peter's name is always first. Every other person writing says Peter and then lists the other ones. He becomes the spokesperson, and Peter says for himself and the other disciples, you are the Christ, the anointed one, the king to end all kings. But Jesus says, and there's like good news here and what seems to be like bad news, because Jesus knows what they're thinking. They've seen everything that he does. I am the Messiah, I am the Christ, I am the anointed one. I am the Son of God, I am the King, but not like what y'all are thinking. You got it. But Jesus knows. Y'all are right. And they're thinking, the king like David, the king that is going to gather the troops, the king that is going to overthrow Rome, the king that is going to get rid of all this idolatry around us, the king like Moses that is going to free us from slavery and bondage. Now, listen, we really can't blame the disciples because they've been thinking this ever since they were being taught as little kids. This is what the Messiah is going to do. For almost a millennia, listen to this. The Jews have been ruled over. 1720, Israel is crushed by the Assyrians, and the 10 tribes are exiled, 10 lost tribes. 586, Judah is conquered by Babylon, and Jerusalem and the first temple are destroyed, and the Jews are all sent in exile. In 538, many of the Jews return from Babylon. Temple's rebuilt, but guess what? Persia comes in, takes them over. And then in 332, Alexander the Great takes them over. And then in 63, Jerusalem is captured by the Roman general Pompey. And so the better part of 1,000 years, they've been ruled over, conquered by somebody else. And the whole time, they're going to synagogue, and they're hearing, but the Messiah's coming, the Messiah's coming. He's going to rescue us. And so when they finally see Jesus, and they see these amazing miracles that he's doing, and they hear him teach the Sermon on the Mount, and then he goes and feeds 20,000 plus people at one shot with fish that never had seen water, or grain that had never been in dirt. Magic, like a miracle that is unbelievable, and they're going to try to force him to be the king. You've got to be it now. We've never seen anything like this. And Jesus says, you're right, I am the anointed one, but the true king has to die. Here's what Jesus said, y'all are right. Y'all are thinking wrong. And after Peter's confession, Jesus said this. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and to suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law. Then they're going to turn him over to the people that are oppressing them, the Romans, and let him be mocked and spit on and flogged and killed and put on a cross. But Jesus told him the third day be raised to life. And he says that at least 4 times to his disciples that we know of, probably more leading up to these last 6 months. And the disciples are like, no way. That's not how the Messiah works. In their word, the Messiah, the anointed one, doesn't die. He conquers. Which doesn't make any sense. I mean, they're really like, this doesn't make any sense. We finally got, you're the one. Now, right before this, over this 2.5 years, they've walked thousands of miles. And they go about 25 miles north to a place called Caesarea Philippi. It's a Gentile city. But its original name was Panis. Does anybody remember like some of the pagan god stuff? The god Pan? I know who the god Pan, remember the little flute with the goat legs? Well, in Greek, he was half man, half goat, and he played the flute. And the reason he played the flute was if you go, this is the area they're at, all these temples and gods are all around. This is where all the Gentiles worship the god Pan. Now, I was going to say what's cool. It's not really cool about worshiping the god Pan. But it meant dancing, sex, and food, and sleep. And he's actually called the god of naps. And the reason he's called the god of naps is because when you would go there, there would be every kind of gluttonous thing you could do to eat and to gorge yourself, and every kind of way, how do you say it? There's any kind of sexual deviant behavior, anything, it's all there. And that's where they go. Now, if you go south, you're going to go to the Jews' temple, who's exactly the opposite of that. So you see why there's a lot of people that hated the Jewish law, because everything in the Jewish law was the exact opposite of everything that was in the Greek gods. The Gentile people didn't like the God of Israel or the temple that was in Jerusalem, or the fact that their law says we're not supposed to do any of those things. But Panis, this area, was changed to Caesarea Philippi kind of to honor Caesar. King Herod died, and then it got divided up between his 4 sons, and one of the sons, remember the other Herod that married Philip's son? Well, this is Philip's area that they're in, and he wanted to name it after Caesar, so he kind of put his name and Caesar's name together, and that's really not, I guess, that important. But this is where we would think of as now like Bethsaida. So this area falls into the hands of Philip the Tetrarch, and there is also a temple there of the mortal deity, which is Caesar, and this other deity, Panis, and they were really hostile to the Jews. And Jesus, this is where the disciples are when they figure it out. So imagine the disciples looking around at these temples, these gods, all of the things that would be idolatry. And Jesus says, what about you? Who do you say that I am? And they're like, you're the Christ. You're the king over all this. You're going to destroy all this. So it's kind of a good location. There's only one Lord, one God. And Peter says, you're it. So what are we going to do now? And Jesus says, we're going to turn around. We're going to head back down, go to Jerusalem. I'm going to die. He's like, that's not how it's supposed to happen. He's playing off all the dead idols that are around there, and the Gentiles worship them. Now listen, we have to think, what about you? What about me? What about us? What about? For 2.5 years, they've seen divine revelation. They've seen thousands of miracles. Miracles which Jesus touched people and they were healed. He spoke and they were healed. He thought about it sometimes and people were healed. People were going around just to touch the corner of his garment and being healed. Teaching like they've never heard. Nobody ever heard anybody teach like Jesus, and thousands came everywhere, wherever he was, to hear. And they've seen everything, and Jesus then does this miraculous feeding miracle. And then right before that, they were in the boat, and it was a bad storm, and Jesus calms the storm by speaking. They were terrified. And then he gets there, does the miracle, and they get back in the boat, except for Jesus wasn't with them this time. And they get stuck in the middle, and Jesus walks 4 miles on the water. And that's when Peter says, well, I would rather be with you, so tell me to come out. Jesus says, come out, and he's walking on the way. And remember last week, like it was miracle after miracle after miracle, because when he starts to doubt, he starts to sink. And he says, Lord, help me. And Jesus picks him up. But he doesn't pick him up and put him in the boat. He picks him up and puts him back on top of the water with him. Remember I said, they say you're a lot lighter in water, but if you're standing on the water, I don't know how much. But it's miracle after miracle. And then they're going to get back in the boat. And it seems like at some point the disciples say, hey, how about we just walk? Like, let's forget the boat. Each time we've gotten in the boat for the last 6 months has been a disaster. Now think about it. They've seen and experienced all of this with Jesus for 2.5 years, 24 hours a day. They're always around him. But this is the first time. The angels say it, the Father at his baptisms, the demons have been saying it. But now, with 6 months left until the cross, Peter gets it. I mean, we could think, well, it's about time, because we've been reading along and we've seen it all along. So when we come to this passage, there's this good news, and that's the confession. What about you? Jesus was questioning his disciples, saying to them, who do people say that I am? Now, here's what Jesus said. Who do people say that I am? And the disciples start to say, some say John the Baptist. That seems like a weird option, since they lived at the same time and John the Baptist's head had been chopped off. Like, John the Baptist was with Jesus a couple of times, but that's what people say. Others say Elijah, and that makes a little bit more sense because he was one of the prophets, and if you remember anything about Elijah, he was supposed to come before the Messiah to, prepare the way for the Messiah, and that was a good option because Elijah was the one who, in Malachi chapter 3 and 4, according to that Elijah's going to come before John the Baptist. But if we go back to 2 Kings, Elijah's been taken to heaven and never died physically. So they're thinking maybe he's just come back. This is Elijah. And also then some say Jeremiah, which is kind of a really weird one, Jeremiah. But, so I was trying to study, why would they pick Jeremiah? Well, there was this bizarre tradition in the first century among the Jews that in the anticipation before the Babylonian captivity, it was said that Jeremiah went to the temple and took the altar of incense and the Ark of the Covenant, and he took them away and he put them on Mount Nebo, and that he was going to bring them back when the Messiah was going to come. And so that story had been circulating for hundreds of years, so they were thinking maybe it's Jeremiah. Now, the disciples finally realized Jesus is the Messiah. He's not any of these things. Now, this had been a kind of highly developed messianic concept. And here's what almost everybody thought. If you were to read any of the teachers, they would have said he was going to be a political ruler, a military ruler. He was going to overthrow whoever it was. At this point, it's Rome. He was going to destroy all of Israel's enemies. He was going to bring blessings to Israel, prosperity to Israel, permanent peace in Israel, elevate Israel to the greatest nation on earth, and everybody would be under and subject to a benevolent, good nation, Israel. And the Messiah is going to reign and dominate the world, and righteousness will flow out of that because that's where the temple is. Now, Jesus wasn't a military leader, didn't even look like one. He wasn't a destroyer of armies. He didn't look or act like the king they thought the king was supposed to look like. We know you're a teacher come from God because nobody can do what you do except God be with him. So we get it. You're a prophet from God. Maybe John the Baptist, maybe Elijah, maybe Jeremiah. And then here's the question he asked his disciples, but what about you? Who's Jesus really concerned about? He's really concerned because they're going to be the ones that are going to take the gospel to the whole world. And he knows he's only got 6 months to go, and these guys got to get it right before he goes, what about you? Who do you say that I am? Beloved, that is the most important question we ever answer. The most important question any human being will ever answer. Who is Jesus? All of us will be accountable and stand before God. The wrong answer means separation. The right answer means eternal life. Everybody has an opinion of who Jesus is. Regular people have an opinion. Philosophers have answers. Scholars have answers. Theologians have answers. Buddhists have answers. Muslims have answers to who Jesus is. The Jews have answers. The atheists, the humanists, religious people. But the answer most people give condemn them. Most everybody's answers condemn them because they're the wrong answers. In fact, the disciples concluded exactly that. And at the end of the Gospel of John, it says this, these things are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. All of the Gospels were written for that reason. These things are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. What's Peter's confession? You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. What about you? Who do you say that I am? When he says you are the Christ, it's Christos. It is for the anointed one. Christos is not a name. Jesus' name, you should call his name Jesus. The name, every name, after the resurrection's Lord. Jesus is the Lord. And Lord is his ultimate title. He's the anointed one, the promised king. Well, what have they been thinking for the last 2.5 years? They don't struggle because there's no evidence of divine power. They don't struggle because they struggle because he doesn't conform to what they thought he was going to be. And it's really hard for them to get over. He's obviously a prophet. They grant him that. But he just hasn't done what the Messiah will do. And they're thinking, where's the conquests? Where's the national independence? Where's our freedom? Where's the power we're supposed to have? Where's the blessing? Why is Rome still around? He's so lowly and humble, and one of the things he did, they got mad about, he paid taxes to Rome. They hated Rome. They thought the Messiah would definitely be the one that ended the taxation thing. Peter says, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. And immediately Jesus says, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonas, because flesh and blood do not reveal this, but my Father who's in heaven. Human reason didn't get them all the way. There needed to be a divine intervention. Experience doesn't get them there. They needed divine intervention to make this confession. That's why it says in 1 Corinthians 12, no man can confess Jesus as Lord but by the Holy Spirit. So there needs to be a divine work. So here comes the revelation from God as to who Jesus is. The remaining doubts disappear. It doesn't mean that they are not going to struggle with the plan. They're going to struggle with the plan. They're going to struggle with the plan for the next 6 months. They're going to struggle with the plan. But it doesn't mean they doubt the person. Then he ordered his disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. I don't want you spreading this around. Don't tell anybody. Well, why would he do that? Well, we know he told the demons to shut up because he didn't want evil to make his announcement. When Jesus healed and did the miracles, lots of times he told them, don't go tell anybody about this, but go to the temple, present yourself. Because he knew the religious leaders, every time he did something like this, was speeding up the process to his death. And there was an exact time that Jesus was going to give his life. And so he tells his disciples, don't say anything yet. After the resurrection, there's no not saying. It's going to be saying all the time. It's going to be the most amazing group of people. You can pronounce Jesus as the Messiah, but it's not the full message yet. Because the Messiah is going to have to die. And they didn't understand this yet. They finally get it. You are the Christ. But they haven't got the hard news yet. It seems like bad news. It's not bad news, but it seems like. The best news ever was just pronounced, and Jesus confirmed it. You're the Christ. You're the Messiah. You're the Anointed One. You're the Son of God. And then the last thing that they would expect, you got it. Yes. Jesus is like, yes. Now, let's head down to Jerusalem, and I'm going to be crucified. And they're like, no. The Redeemer of Israel is going to die? And for the next 6 months, this becomes his theme of teaching, explaining to them why he had to do what he was going to do. The Son of Man has to be delivered into the hands of these men. And when he's been killed, he will rise 3 days later. We're going to Jerusalem. They're going to mock me, spit on me, scourge me. For the next 6 months, they are all aware of what Jesus is telling them. And Jesus is thinking about it all the time. The Son of Man did not come to serve, to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. Now he's going to unfold that over the rest of the chapters we're going to see. Why must you suffer? Now there's a little participle in Greek. It's de, and it means it's necessary. Beloved, it's necessary. It has to happen. I must suffer these things. Jesus, the Anointed One, the Messiah, the King of Kings. But for you to receive the grace that you need for forever, I must be betrayed and denied and abandoned. I must go through injustice and prison and beating and crucifixion. Jesus must suffer these many things. And to them, the idea that the Messiah could suffer, the Son of Man, this is incredible, divine figure could suffer, it made no sense. Because the Messiah was supposed to be the one that came to defeat evil and injustice. And how could he defeat evil and injustice if he lets evil and injustice be done to him? The most unjust thing in all of history was what they did to Jesus. How is that possible? It seemed ridiculous. It seemed impossible. And you know what Peter says here? How strong the word is? Peter rebukes Jesus. And that is the same word that Jesus rebukes the demons with. So Peter's angry. And Peter is condemning this plan, this go to Jerusalem thing. Why is he so freaked out? Peter is freaked out because his whole life he would have heard every time that they got together and they sang about the Messiah coming, he was going to end all this. And Jesus is like, yeah, I'm the Messiah. I'm the King. You got it. But I'm going to Jerusalem to defeat evil and injustice. And I'm going to do it by not going to the throne, but by going to the cross. But the cross means helplessness. It was the worst form of execution ever. On the cross, you're humiliated and stripped naked, and you're nailed. And everyone walks by, and it is the epitome of helplessness. And Peter's like, no, no. And Jesus says, get thee behind me, Satan. You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men. Peter went from this great confession, he gets it, to shut up Satan. And Jesus explains why. The king doesn't die. And Jesus is like, yeah, this king does. God forbid that it would never happen to you, Peter said. He's not asking questions now. He's making statements. He's like, we're not going to do that. And when I was studying this, idiomatically, there's an intense phrase here that says, may God grant you better than that. That's kind of what Peter's saying. This isn't going to happen. Turning around, seeing his disciples, Jesus rebuked Peter. And he actually says, you're a hindrance, you're a stumbling block to me right now. Get out of my sight. You're not setting your mind on what God has planned. You're thinking of the kingdom like James and John were. Am I going to be on your right hand? Am I going to be on your left? It actually is, the Greek word means you're a trap. You're baiting a trap for me by just saying that. If you're trying to dissuade me from the cross, he needs to go. And we kind of know what that means. We need Jesus to die. And why do we need that? Because we need someone to pay a debt that we can't pay. And forgiveness is going to entail suffering. If you've ever been truly wronged and you forgive, the forgiver suffers. Or you could do it the other way and make the perpetrator suffer. But either way, someone suffers if there's a debt. Jesus says, I must suffer. Either you're going to pay the penalty for sin or I will. The only way that Peter or us can get forgiveness, the only way that we could find the pardon that we need, the only way he can not judge us is if he goes to the cross and absorbs the judgment himself. So Jesus said, I must suffer. I'm the king, but not like the king you were imagining. I'm coming to renew the world. All kings go to a throne, but now I'm going to the cross. Please bow your heads. The good news, Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. The really tough news is Jesus the King's going to die. The good news is he's going to rise. And the really good news is called the gospel. That Jesus died and rose again for the salvation of all who believe in him. So what's the most important question we will ever answer? What about you? What about you? Who do you say Jesus is?